Cure cancer. It's a big deal. We're going to look, excuse me, briefly at Genesis 49. We're going to finish it up with the death of Jacob, and then his burial, and beginning in chapter 50, and then look at the death and burial of Joseph. So we'll look at that. But so we'll be in Genesis 49 and 50 this evening. I think we should be able to complete the book. Maybe not. It's a lot of verses, but I think we're determined. So, and I haven't gotten any feedback or suggestions for where we go next. So I will throw it open to our internet crowd as well, since we have some pretty regular folks tuning in for that. And if you don't have any preference, you let me pick, then I don't want to hear any complaints. So I can't believe you picked that book. I promise it won't be Job. I promise you that. We'll get a book shorter than Genesis, I think, the next time around. And
how about Ruth?
We could do Ruth if you want to do Ruth.
Just thinking shorter.
It is shorter, and it's a very important and very powerful book. So
I'm thinking Jude.
Jude is a short book. 3rd John. So we got some. It might be nice to do something kind of as a, finish out the summer before we get into something else, maybe in the fall. But worth considering, especially Ruth. I like that idea. Anyway, Genesis chapter 29, Genesis chapter 49, verses 29 through 33. This is Jacob speaking. Then he charged them, his sons, and said to them, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field from Ephron the Hittite for a burial site. There they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah, and they buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it purchased from the sons of Heth. When Jacob finished charging his sons, he drew his feet into the bed and breathed his last. Okay, just as a little bit of review, then I'll throw it open to y'all. We looked for 2 weeks at the first part of chapter 49, which concerns the prophecies Jacob issues regarding all of his 12 sons. He's already prophesied back in verse 48 about the sons of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh. So this is about the 12 sons that he had born to him through Leah, Rachel, and their handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah. And those prophecies are interesting and kind of explain, at least to some extent, the interaction between the tribes. It's the intra-political and historic dealings between the tribes of Israel, and how they kind of saw each other, and it kind of explains their attitudes towards each other, I guess you could say, to some extent. And now we read about Jacob wrapping things up and giving his final words, and then joining the invisible choir. So Sherry is here. Good evening, Sherry. Good evening, Robin, and good evening, Thelma. So any thoughts on the death of Jacob?
It's interesting to me that they go through the whole scenario of where Abraham bought the cave and the field with it, and yada, yada, yada. And Jacob buried his wife Leah there, but his wife Rachel, who he loved, he buried her alongside the road,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of strange in a way. Maybe that was the only thing he could do. Hard to say. I mean, they make quite a point of saying who all was buried in this particular tomb, cave, whatever.
Leah is the unfavored wife during life, but gets the status and of the honor of being buried next to Jacob. So if you go to cemeteries, sometimes you can find this on your own. Hopefully, you're not just skulking around cemeteries, but sometimes maybe you're going to visit the graves of relatives and everything, where there have been people who were widowed and remarried, and sometimes that can happen pretty early in life. Maybe they were married to one person and had their children with that person, but then that person died, and then they remarried subsequently and had many happy years together. And maybe that person was widowed. Then it's kind of who gets buried where. And usually, I guess what happens is you go back and get buried next to your first spouse, especially I think if the children are involved in all of that. So my grandfather and grandmother, my dad's parents, are buried next to each other in Wagner, Oklahoma. And I didn't go by Wagner. We saw a sign for it recently, but we didn't go there. Whenever you get off the highway, the turnpikes in Oklahoma, you have to have exact change for the toll. You got to throw it in a little basket. And sometimes it figures out you gave them enough, and sometimes it figures out you shorted them and is waiting for some more, and it won't give you the green light, and you have to go anyway. So what I found through driving through Oklahoma is however many coins you have, it's not enough. You'll need more. So we experienced that recently, but hopefully no big tickets coming our way, because we did have to shortchange them once.
You don't think of toll roads in Oklahoma?
Well, if they have them, the turnpikes are quite popular there, and especially up in northeast Oklahoma, where we kind of skulk around. And but their grandma and granddad are buried there, and together forever or something like that is on their tombstone. And it's kind of interesting when you think about what Jesus says about eternity, about the resurrection in marriage, which is that they are neither married nor given in marriage. It's one of those statements. A lot of people want you to definitively state what's going to happen and what heaven is going to be like and all of that. And I think it's very hard to do all that. I think you can find things that we go up. And then for one thing in Revelations, this New Jerusalem comes down. So I think what Jesus has to say about the resurrection is one of the least mysterious statements about the resurrection, that this is post-resurrection and you're not married to one another. And that's something we kind of reject, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of something we don't want to think about that. We don't want to think about an eternity. If you've had a long and happy marriage, you don't want to think about eternity without your spouse being your spouse. You don't want to think any guy can come up and ask your wife out, after your resurrection up there in heaven. But yeah, so Mark might get kicked out of heaven if that happens. Everybody asks Karen out while he's up there. Yes, sir.
Again, we have so much trouble trying to figure out, these eternal things and how they work. And it's been said several times, by different people that some of us are just going to be so happy to be there, we're not going to care what's going on. And then other times it talks about how our time will be spent in praising God, and it's a place of joy and happiness and all that. You won't be worried about all of those things. Is the picture I get, but yet, like you say, we have trouble trying to we're still looking at it from the earthly perspective. But when we get there, there's a lot of things we ain't gonna worry about.
Well, so much of it is apocryphal or prophetic language, and that is meant to work on a lot of different levels and be kind of mysterious and resist hyper definitions, precise understandings. But be that as it may or may not be, if you have it all figured out for eternity, you know exactly what's going to happen, and maybe you even know when it's going to happen. Good for you. That's not the concern here, really. Jacob and Leah in marriage are going to be, in a sense, this together again, like my grandparent. My granddad went first. He was in the ground first. Now grandma, a few years later, she went. And so she's buried right next to granddad. And I did a funeral for one of our ladies' husbands in Aberdeen, and he got buried at the Tahoma National Cemetery. And she is 100 years old in a week or two, and has had a rough year. But when she does pass on, evidently, she's going to be buried, and she will be buried on top of her husband. They'll put her casket right on top of Al's, and I'll have a feeling that she'll look around at him and say, "See, I told you so," at some point. So it's kind of, but there's a lot of mystery around this sort of thing. But what's going on here is, in a sense, a very temporal thing. Leah is getting an honor after all of this dishonor and disgrace and shame of being treated as a second-class citizen, a second-class wife. That which was denied to her in life is now being given to her in death. She is the wife who will lay alongside of the husband. So there's that going on. But at the same time, as Jacob looks back to where he will be buried, and looks back and tells a little bit of the story about that, death is final in a sense, but at the same time, it's not final. It's not the afterlife that Christians anticipate, but it is a confidence. I mean, this is a very peaceful and dignified death. And if you've been around people as they die, so often they are denied anything resembling peace and dignity. It can be really hard. It can be really awkward. It can be really difficult for everybody involved. But Jacob is passing on in a very dignified manner. He's able to give his funeral directions to his sons as it approaches. It's a very dignified, peaceful departure for a man whose life was not always dignified and peaceful. For a man, again, in death, he is getting something maybe he didn't have a lot of in his life because of his sharp dealings, because of the people around him. Whatever it was, there's a lot of turmoil in the life of Jacob, and he brings a lot of it on himself. But he dies in confidence. And that is, I think, one of the truly great gifts God's people have, is that through faith we can view, approach, and maybe even experience death confidently. Not always easily, not always timely, but we don't deny our mortality. We don't act like we're not going to die. But we do feel like we will live beyond death. The death will be something we experience, and we will live beyond it. And hopefully we have that confidence that it's not just comforting. It's not just a platitude to give someone when they are very upset and very hurting and sorrowful. It is the abiding sense that God will keep his promises, and we have a confident attitude about that. And that is something that really should shape our entire lives. You know, there's, like I said, I don't dwell a lot on the end times or eternity or anything like that, because I find it to be somewhat vague, and once we're there, there's not going to be much we can do about it anyway. So I think our task right now is to live lives worthy of the calling we have received, and I try to talk about that we, in my sermons especially, we've all received that calling, almost all of us in the gathering. So I'm not trying to get you called. You've been called and you responded. What does that mean? I think we spend our whole lives understanding what it means to be called. Jacob was called. It was not an easy life for him. He made a lot of his own difficulties, but some of them were other people's makings. He had a lot of sorrow, a lot of pain. As a privileged member of the family of faith, he still had a lot of agony in his life. But he also saw God work to keep his promises. And as he told Joseph in, I guess, chapter 48, he lived long enough not only to see Joseph again, but to see Joseph's children. So he can see God moving through the course of human events to fulfill his promises. They are not completely fulfilled, but Jacob as a person, as Israel, isn't required to be around for those promises to be fulfilled. It doesn't have to be the person to whom those promises are made, specifically made. He can anticipate through faith that God will keep his promises, even though he is leaving this life without them being completely fulfilled. And most of us are going to pass on without everything we would like to see resolved. You know, they heard someone the other day talking about, they asked him if he had his affairs in order. I don't know. I maybe have a different attitude about it. If I'm about to die, I don't care about my affairs. I say, that's your problem now, buddy. So that's kind of how I would think I would look at it. We'll see. But that was a question that was asked of someone. We want to have everything kind of set up. And certainly it is nice if you've had when my mother's mother passed away, she had made all the plans for the funeral and everything. All they did was make one phone call and everything was taken care of. The dress she was going to be buried in, who was picking her up, where she was going to be, everything was done with one phone call. And that is very nice. I mean, that is a great relief. I'm not trying to tell you, don't worry about it, don't plan for it, don't do anything like that. I'm saying I probably won't worry about it, and I probably won't plan for it, and I won't do it. So don't do as I will probably do. Do as you are guided to do. But, Jacob is, in a sense, taking some of the burdens off of his son. I want you to do this, and this is where it's at, and this is who I'm going to be with. And that points them simultaneously back and forward. It points them to the history of the promised land and why it's their land. Now, this particular parcel, Abraham bought and paid for, sorry. But the land as a whole, that's where they belong. And that's where he's going to be buried. And so the one who has gone on before will be there awaiting the arrival of the descendants. It's going to be quite some time, but he will be awaiting them. And he dies in this very peaceful setting, a very dignified setting, gathered to his people. So this is, despite the hardships he has in his life, this is about the best death he could have under the circumstances. And this would be seen and understood by the readers as dying full of years with your children around you, with hope for the future for them, in the land. This is about as good as it gets, really. So it's a very blessed passing. And wish everyone could go out in a similar situation. So any other thoughts before we move on to chapter 50? Nell says she's here too. Hi, Nell. Hope you and Dale are doing okay.
We don't really think of Jacob being a prophet, but I think it's interesting that God gave him the ability to know and prophesy everything that was going to happen for the future of all of his children.
Yeah, in the Old Testament tradition, prophets were the ones who gave prophecy, and that was your requirement. If you prophesied, you were a prophet. You didn't have to go to prophet school or, be of a certain tribe. You had to be a Levite to be a priest, but you did not have to be of any tribe, any occupation, or anything like that. You could be a prophet. If God came upon you and gave you his word to give to someone else, and many times, again, prophetic utterances are not always predictive. And these prophecies from Jacob over his sons are predictive, somewhat specific in some cases, in other cases pretty generalized. And they could be seen as true or untrue from a variety of ways. It is really, to me, the Zebulun prophecy is difficult because he will dwell at the seashore, and he didn't. Asher got his promised inheritance, but he benefited. He was enriched by Zebulun as a tribe was enriched by the seas, but he did not dwell at the seashore. But overall, this is how they understood each other, and it's Jacob is a prophet. He is the chosen messenger of God. He is Israel. He is, in a sense, the personification of Israel because he contends with man and with God. And Israel will contend with both their neighbors and with their God. Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay, chapter 50 of Genesis, final chapter. We will not finish tonight looking up at the we'll look at the burial, really, of Jacob now, and we'll finish him up, and then we'll finish up 50 next week, and then maybe do an introduction on whatever text we decide to study at that point. So chapter 50 of Genesis. Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him. Verses 1 through 14 of chapter 50, sorry. Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Now 40 days were required for it, for such is the period required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. When the days of mourning for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your sight, please speak to Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, Behold, I am about to die. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, then I will return. Pharaoh said, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the household of Joseph and his brothers and his father's household. They left only their little ones and their flocks and their herds in the land of Goshen. There also went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. Now, when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with very great and sorrowful lamentation. and he observed 7 days mourning for his father. Now, when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning for the Egyptians." Therefore, it was named Abel Mizraim, which is beyond the Jordan. Okay. What do we think about that?
The part about the embalmings, the part I know, I'm not aware of somebody of that nature of Israelite being embalmed. Because in their society, normally, they'd be buried in what, within 24 hours.
It's not in keeping with the Mosaic Law, which doesn't exist yet, but it is, again, understood. That's how they would look at it.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
And this is a departure from that. I'm going to let Mark talk, and then I'll come back to that because that's a really good point. Yes, sir.
Well, it's the amount of dignitaries from Egypt that went show the
Respect that they had for
respect they had for Joseph and he was, for Joseph, I guess. I can't imagine him. I mean, that's quite a funeral procession. I don't know how far that is. They didn't do it overnight. It shows the respect they had for Joseph anyway.
You thought Aretha Franklin's funeral went on a long time. I mean, this was this is a lot longer than that. It is a very regal procession. It carries with it the authority and the impact that has on the Canaanites is this is of Egypt, and that kind of comes back to what Robert talks about, which is the embalming process going on, and that is very Egyptian. It is not very Jewish. It is not very of the nature of or in keeping with the law of Moses. Again, which doesn't exist yet, but in the chronology here, but it is, again, the readers would have understood it that way. So they would have seen Jacob's burial as, in a sense, very Egyptian, but at the same time still back in the land, back in the promised land, back in the land of Canaan. So it is still kind of in both arenas, I guess you could say. It is still Jewish too. It is still Israelite burial, as opposed to purely Egyptian. But the ceremony, the embalming, I don't know how all that goes and what it all takes to do all that. 40 days for it to cure up, I guess, the mummy to completely cure. But one commentary I read said that the normal period of mourning for a pharaoh when he died would have been 72 days. Jacob's period of mourning within Egypt is 70, so almost equal to, even as a foreigner, even as the one who hasn't done and lined the pockets of Pharaoh, even in that, as again, maybe perhaps an homage to Joseph, an honoring to Joseph. Jacob experiences this very regal Egyptian burial that is also somewhat, in fact, I guess, in an eternal sense, would be more Jewish. To be buried where he's buried matters more than all this other stuff. But yeah, this is, the Jewish rites around burial show that people didn't usually travel very far, and that you really couldn't be a professional undertaker in their culture because it made you ceremonially unclean every time you touched a dead body. So if you did it as a living, you would always be unclean. You could never be a part of going to temple or anything like that. So it's a family oriented. Some of y'all can still remember when burials were really more family experiences. And my dad helped dig a grave for a relative once, and I had a good friend, a lady who lived in Aberdeen, and she's somewhere down in Bend now, I think. But her mother died at their home, and they called, and the cost of the funeral home coming to pick her up was, several $100s or whatever. She's a very practical girl. She didn't want to pay that, so she just put mom in the back of the station wagon and took her to the funeral home. Here's mom. So that's our culture around funerals is ours, and it's changing. I've talked about that already. That it's changing radically, and they had theirs as well. And the idea of touching a dead body. Yes, it makes you ceremonially impure, but that's not a bad thing. Just being impure doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It just maybe means you came in contact with something that means you need to, spend a little time away from everybody else. So, and if you think about that in the context of a funeral, how nice would it be after your loved one dies to take care of them, to bury them and all that, and then be free from any social obligations. Everybody's getting a week off after their loved one dies. And that's something, as you go through the laws of impurity and all of that, again, we see it sometimes as always punishment, but isn't it nice sometimes to have time away from everyone else? And, so that's something what's going on. In Egypt, evidently, they did have professional burial people because that's who attended to Jacob. But so
there's also, if you would, there's again a contrast here in out of respect for Joseph, all of these Egyptian dignitaries and everything, and this big hoo-ha, and then later on it says, and they forgot what Joseph did, and there's a big change in Joseph's status, after the new pharaohs come along.
Oh, well, Joseph's legacy, I guess you could say, and as we will look at next week, this has ramifications for the family. What happens now that the patriarch's gone? If you have seen the Godfather films, there's some biblical overtones to the story. I think Francis Ford Coppola borrowed, or Mario Puzo, who wrote the books, maybe Coppola who adapted them, borrowed from them to some extent. When Marlon Brando's character dies in the first one, and Al Pacino's character rises to the top, he has all these people whacked. He has all these rivals and people that did his dad wrong killed. In the story of David, when David dies, and on his orders, when he dies and Solomon becomes king, Solomon starts having people whacked like crazy too. If you did David wrong, that was it. Well, also in The Godfather 2, Fredo, the kind of challenged brother, betrays Michael, the head brother, and Michael doesn't do anything to hurt him as long as his mother is alive. And then when Mama Corleone dies, Fredo goes fishing and doesn't come back. He sleeps with the fish. He's down there with Luca Brasi now. So, it's, now that Papa's dead, what's going to happen to the brothers? And we'll kind of look at that next week. Let's read verses 12 through 14 first. Thus his sons did for him as he had charged them, for his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field for a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So they took care of business as Jacob commanded. They did exactly what their father said. And now they have to go back and they're going to return to Egypt. They did not take, as the text told us, they did not take their little ones with them. They left, I guess we could presume, servants or slaves in charge of their flocks and also in charge of their little one. They must have had some kind of babysitting service in Egypt back then, I guess. It's this going back and forth that I think is interesting, this entering the promised land, but returning to Egypt. It's still not time for them really to be in the promised land. And you think that might be a good opportunity. Well, let's just all go back now. But that's not God's plan for them. That's not his intention for them. So that's not what happens. They go up and they return back to Egypt. And I think this kind of going forward and coming back is a good example or a good story for us as Christians today. I think maybe it's because we have so many blessings. I'm not sure. But we want to stay, the old song, keep on the sunny side of life. We want to stay in the good and wide and spacious land all the time. We want to stay where everything works well. And where we feel and perceive our blessedness and everything makes sense. But we don't get to stay on the sunny side of life. We don't become the light of the world to stay in the light all the time. We are become the light of the world so that we may go into darkness and bring light into darkness. Our blessedness isn't so we can just be perpetually blessed. Our blessedness is so that we may be instruments by which God blesses others and shows his love for them so that they too will become blessed in a saving relationship with God. And then they become messengers. It's really one giant pyramid scheme. I think Amway studied the Bible too, somewhere. Joe Amway, whatever his name is. But you sign someone up and you get signed up and then you sign someone up. And, that's kind of how it's supposed to work. And so we have to go into the light to be saved. We become light so we may go into darkness, but we can't stay in darkness all the time. We can't stay surrounded. We do have to come back together so that we can be renewed, so that we can go back out again. And then to return once again. We go back and forth into each other's presence and then out into the world. Just as if you think about a lot of people don't want to talk about the cross anymore because the grave is empty. They want to be at the empty grave all the time. Well, that's nice, but we can't take away the story of the cross either. And the truth is we have to go back and forth. We have to survey the wondrous cross, and then we have to find, like Mary, the empty tomb. And we go back and forth. And when we experience really good, blessed times, that's a time to consider the cross. A message of suffering, a message of God's identification and compassion for a suffering world. And when we are suffering, that's a great time to consider the empty grave. That God triumphs over suffering. He triumphs over death. So we kind of go back and forth. They go up to Canaan, they come back to Egypt. The brothers have already gone from Canaan down to Egypt, back up to Canaan, back down to Egypt. That's life. That's where life is a journey. Life is a sojourning. We are in a sense, a working vacation. We're the guy driving the tour bus. We don't get to just be tourists having a good time. We got to be the driver. We got to be the person bringing other people into the grace of God so that they may become tour guides as well. Okay. Well, we will wrap up next week and we will introduce our next text, do some background on the book and stuff like that. So
what I was referring to was in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8, it says, then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt.